Before we talk about wars, portals, and demon blood, let me tell you something about the person explaining all of this to you. I used to be a hardcore Warcraft fan. I read almost every book set in this universe, but that was back when I was still in school. Since then, I've read a lot of genuinely great literature, and it has made me much more skeptical of video game stories. To me, storytelling in games has started to feel mediocre. It rarely has the depth, coherence, or internal logic that you find in good books. More often than not, the biggest problems with game narratives come from the limitations and conventions of the medium itself. It's the same issue you see in comic books. Writers often shape the story around the needs of the format rather than around what makes sense for the narrative. Warcraft is no exception. In fact, while working on this video, I reread the Warcraft Chronicles, and it only reinforced my opinion. The original Warcraft trilogy had a story that was perfectly acceptable for a video game, but once World of Warcraft came along, the story became little more than a tool for creating raids. As a result, it gradually stopped making much sense, regardless of the expansion. Again, this is largely because MMORPG impose even more gameplay constraints on storytelling, but that's a topic for another time. In this video, I won't just be covering Warcraft's story. I'll also explain why I consider it mediocre, and point out which moments exist purely because of game mechanics, and would be impossible in real history or real life. As sources, I'll be using not only the games themselves, but also the Warcraft Chronicles. From Blizzard's perspective, however, the Chronicles are not the absolute truth. They're written from the Titans' point of view, and the Titans are individuals with their own biases and perspectives, meaning they are not completely objective. Blizzard did this intentionally so that fans wouldn't constantly complain whenever the Chronicles contradicted later developments caused by retcons. A perfect example is the Lich King. In the Chronicles, we're told that he was created by the Burning Legion, but after the Shadowlands retcons, we learned that the Lich King was actually created by the jailer himself. Before the start of the First War, meaning the First Warcraft, we need to clarify the motivations of the Orcs, why they decided to launch a full-scale invasion against the humans. The short version goes like this. The Orcs' world of Draenor was dying. Gul'dan offered them the blood of demons to drink. After drinking the demon blood, the world started dying even faster. Gul'dan and Medivh opened a portal to Azeroth so the Orcs could begin their invasion. That's the short version, which doesn't work for us. So let's dive deeper into the prequel to the First Warcraft. The Orcs lived on the planet Draenor, which in the future would come to be known as Outland. Originally, there was no Horde. There were separate Orc Clans that fought local wars among themselves, but their main enemy was the Ogres. Many people mistakenly think that Orc culture is nomadic. That's a surface-level assumption. What they did borrow from nomadic cultures is partly their architecture and the name Horde itself, drawing a parallel to the Golden Horde from real history. But beyond that, Orcs are essentially Germanic barbarians of the ancient era. Germanic specifically because unlike the Celts, they lacked advanced military metallurgy. If you look at Orcs before the World of Warcraft era, you'll notice that iron armor on warriors is almost completely absent. They either went half naked or wore partial leather armor. Those giant shoulder pads are purely a game design choice, because in reality, they wouldn't just be useless. They'd actually restrict movement and get in the way. Their main weapon was the axe, primitive in design with no standardization whatsoever. Yes, there are Orcs with decent iron equipment, but that's generally the exception, like Thrall, because even chieftains didn't always have proper armor. For example, Thrall's father, Duratan, wore nothing more than a wolf pelt on his back, despite being the chieftain of his clan. The downfall of the Orcs came from their neighbors, the Draenei. The Draenei are a race of Eredar who rejected the Burning Legion, which is why the Legion had been hunting them ever since. They coexisted with the Orcs in neutrality. There were occasional skirmishes when Orcs raided their caravans, but for the most part, they never went to war with each other. Everything changed when Kil'jaeden found out which planet the Draenei were on. He immediately began plotting their genocide, and the Orcs helped him carry it out. Specifically, an Orc named Gul'dan. Gul'dan was a resentful cripple, and that was exactly the kind of person Kil'jaeden needed. He granted Gul'dan immense fell power, and commanded him to unite the Orcs and destroy the Draenei. The Orcs have a shaman caste, and these shamans commune with elementals and spirits who are extremely temperamental. If you fail to appease them, droughts, famines, diseases, and the like begin to follow. So it wasn't particularly hard for Gul'dan to simply rough up these elementals, which offended them and set everything in motion. Drought, famine, disease, and most importantly, the elementals went completely silent. They stopped communicating with the shamans entirely, giving no explanation for why they were so offended. It's worth mentioning a character named Ner'zhul.
My life for Ner'zhul.
He was the most senior shaman among all the Orcs, and even rival clans respected him and his word. So Gul'dan worked his way into his trust and began spreading the idea that all their misfortunes were the Draenei's fault, and that if they punished the Draenei, the elementals would return. Kil'jaeden's plan worked. Gul'dan started preaching that fell magic was superior to elemental magic, which is honestly true. Warlocks in World of Warcraft do more damage than shamans, but that's beside the point. He baited them into drinking demon blood, and after that little treat, they wiped out the Draenei. Well, almost wiped out. Either way, destroying the Draenei did nothing to help them get rid of the diseases, the famine, or the terrible weather. On top of that, because of the fell magic, their land had literally begun to die. Gul'dan told the orcs, well, tough luck, this world is done for, but there's another world out there, one we can conquer and live in prosperity. And so the preparations for the invasion of Azeroth began. The Orc Clans. The Blackrock clan is one of the largest and most warlike clans. Their flag is the one displayed on the main menu of Warcraft 3. At the start of the First War, the chieftain of the Blackrock clan will be the war chief of the entire Horde. Notable orcs from this clan: Blackhand, the first war chief of the Horde and a character with arguably the most ridiculous death in Hollywood history. Orgrim Doomhammer, the second war chief, gave his armor and his hammer to Thrall, and the orcs later named their city in Kalimdor in his honor. And Varrock Sarfang, the most frustratingly brainless orc, and honestly one of the worst written characters in Warcraft history. His son died shamefully at the hands of Arthas, later becoming a punching bag boss for players. Sarfang himself shamefully betrayed the Horde, and later died just as shamefully at the hands of Sylvanas. The Warsong Clan. The Warsong Clan participated in neither the First War nor the Second. The reason is simple. Their chieftain, Grommash Hellscream, could rival Blackhand in terms of charisma, so Blackhand decided to leave them behind to rot on Draenor. Notable figures: Grommash Hellscream, the very first orc to drink demon blood, and the very first to drink it twice. He redeemed himself by killing Manaroth. Garrosh Hellscream, Grommash's son, and the only genuinely good war chief of the Horde after Thrall founded the new Horde. The Frostwolves clan. The Frostwolves did pass through the Dark Portal, but took no part in the wars. Gul'dan feared they were counter-revolutionary, so he banished them from the Horde, after which they headed north to the Alterac Mountains. Notable figures: Duratan, chieftain of the clan and Thrall's father, whose only narrative purpose is to conceive Thrall. Draka, Duratan's wife and Thrall's mother, whose only purpose is to give birth to Thrall. And Drekthar, the final boss of the most insufferable battleground in the entire history of World of Warcraft. Alright, I'm not going to go through every single orc clan. I'll explain them as they come up in the story. Let's get back to the point, specifically to Azeroth, and more precisely to Medivh, and his motivations for opening the portal. Medivh had a mother named Aegwynn. She was just like him, a guardian, meaning an overpowered troublemaker. She hunted demons. In one particular battle, she fought Sargeras himself, or rather, his avatar. She technically won, but not really. His spirit entered her, and when she became pregnant with Medivh, that spirit transferred into the newly conceived child. And you don't need a high IQ to figure out that Sargeras was able to manipulate and eventually outright control, which is why he created the portal and opened it together with Gul'dan. To be fair though, Gul'dan had no idea who Medivh was, or that Sargeras was pulling his strings. So basically, Medivh's backstory is almost identical to Jesus, except the spirit was evil. The First War is, let's say, the calm before the storm. It's the smallest of the 4 wars, assuming of course we count the Fourth War as canon. The First War was fought exclusively between the humans of Stormwind, the southernmost kingdom on the continent, and the Orcs, who for their part opened the portal at the far south as well. If we draw a historical analogy, the conflict between the Alliance and the Horde is comparable to the conflict between Rome and the northern barbarians. Yes, the human cities strongly resemble medieval architecture, but I have serious issues with their feudal system, if you can even call it that. But that's a topic for another time. For now, let's talk about the population and army sizes of Stormwind and the Horde. The problem is that these numbers simply don't exist, which is a massive issue. The only figure I managed to find is the population of Stormwind after the Third War, and even that data is no longer considered canon, but it's better than nothing. So what do we have for Stormwind? 200,000 residents at the time of classic World of Warcraft. Of those 200,000, 140,000 humans, 28,000 dwarves, 20,000 high elves, 8,000 half-elves, and 4,000 night elves. The number looks pretty large, but keep in mind that after the Third War, there was an enormous influx of refugees from Lordaeron and other kingdoms. Stormwind lost the First War, and yes, that's a spoiler, but not a particularly important one, so casualties must have been high as well. On top of that, they were fighting other enemies like trolls even before the orcs showed up. It's all very complicated and very approximate. So let's put Stormwind's pre-First War population at 180,000, exclusively humans with no other races, since other races only began migrating to Stormwind when it started being rebuilt. The historical equivalent would be Paris, which had roughly the same population by the 15th century. One important note, this figure refers specifically to people living inside the city. I'm not accounting for the population outside the city walls, which was at minimum comparable in size to the city itself. But for the purposes of these calculations, I'll be working with the city population only. The army. And here the problems start again. The human military system operates on unclear principles. In theory, since the kingdom superficially looks like a medieval one, the system should follow feudal rules. But honestly, I don't know of a single feudal lord in the lore besides the king himself. Alright, again for simplicity, I'll use the default late medieval army model. These numbers will reflect the period before the orc invasion, more or less peacetime. The professional army, 1.5% of the city population, which comes out to 2,700 soldiers. This includes city guards, rural patrols, the royal guard, knights. As with any medieval society, the king can call the banners, and every lord is obligated to bring a detachment.
Call the banners.
That adds another roughly 2,000 professional and semi-professional cavalry and men-at-arms. Then there's the militia. In medieval cities, the militia typically made up around 12% of the population, but this is pure cannon fodder, barely trained. In numbers, that's another 21,000 commoners. As we can see from these numbers, in peacetime, the army of any kingdom is quite small. It takes time to mobilize. First you call your banners, then you grow the professional army, then you start calling up the militia. The orcs had an incredible advantage, the advantage of surprise. But let's move on to the orc numbers, and things get even messier there. There are two statistics, again non-canon, but it's what we have. At the time of the original World of Warcraft, Orgrimmar had a population of 11,200 orcs. And also at the time of World of Warcraft, the Blackrock clan had 1,700 orcs. We can work with these numbers a little. First of all, it wasn't only able-bodied men who passed through the portal, women and elders came through as well, and by extension children too. But while elders and children were a burden on the army, women on the other hand often joined its ranks, provided they were healthy and not pregnant. Unlike humans, where strict patriarchy was the norm, in World of Warcraft you can see female guards in armor or in the king's personal guard, but that's just a game mechanic and modern messaging. By default, women simply had no place in a medieval army. You might ask, so why can women fight among the orcs? And the answer is simple. Because orcs are modeled after Germanic barbarians. And we historically know that Germanic barbarian women fought alongside men in battles against Rome. The numbers work out like this. The total orc population was approximately 60,000, including women, elders, and children. On screen, you can see the breakdown by clan. Out of those 60,000 orcs, 25,000 were pure combat warriors. For the humans, this is a pretty grim situation, but thankfully, the orcs are not the sharpest tools in the shed. As I mentioned earlier, the Frostwolves were banished, which is minus 3,800 warriors. The Warsong clan, the Bleeding Hollow clan, and a few smaller clans were left behind to rot in Outland, which is another minus 4,100 warriors. So at the start of the war, the orcs had a clean fighting force of 17,000. Of course, they didn't all march through the portal at once in a group of 17,000, but either way, we have our number locked in. First, the orcs sent a scouting party through the portal. After surveying the area, they began kidnapping and killing humans. Word reached Stormwind, and the king decided to send out a unit to investigate the threat. But before we get to the first clash between humans and orcs, let's talk about the physical characteristics of each race. Since Stormwind represents a loosely medieval setting, I'll use Northern European humans as the baseline. Human height, 180 centimeters versus 215 centimeters for orcs. Human weight, 80 kilograms versus 150 kilograms for orcs. Sprint speed and armor, 11 kilometers per hour for humans versus 16 kilometers per hour for orcs. Metabolism, 2,500 calories per day for humans pain tolerance, average for humans, while orcs, especially those under the influence of demon blood, may feel no pain at all. Again, these figures are approximate, but I tried to keep them as grounded as possible. From these numbers, we can see that orcs are physiologically far superior to humans, in the same way that the average man is physically superior to the average woman. But there are two key factors to consider: intelligence and daily food consumption. Orcs are pure carnivores. Unlike humans, they are not omnivores, so sitting around snacking on berries simply isn't an option for them. They need meat, and in massive quantities. By my calculations, 17,000 warriors alone require roughly 15 tons of meat per day, and that's not even counting non-combatants. Yes, that is an absolutely insane amount. And here comes the question of whether orcs eat humans or not. My take is no, or at most as a rare ritual among certain clans, nothing more. Economically, it simply doesn't make sense. It's far more profitable to raid and capture settlements and have the locals supply them with meat. This is also why long-term guerrilla tactics don't work in their favor. Their main objective is to seize all human food supply centers as quickly as possible. The first skirmish between humans and orcs took place near the Dark Portal. The terrain there is swampy, which put both sides at a disadvantage. The chronicles state that Lothar's scouting party won several small victories, but how realistic is that, given the sheer size of the orcs? Actually, it's a fairly plausible scenario. Yes, orcs are massive, but their average intelligence is lower. Humans are better organized in small groups than orcs. On top of that, Lothar's unit consisted of knights, late medieval knights, meaning they had exceptional plate armor and outstanding military training. The orcs, meanwhile, were fighting half-naked, one or two thrusts into the armpit or the thigh, and an orc is just as mortal as anyone else. Either way, those victories didn't amount to much. The orcs were replenishing their ranks too quickly, and Lothar had no choice but to retreat. He reported back to the king, "We need to prepare for a full-scale war." A little about Lothar: besides having an item named after him in Dota, he was the supreme commander of Stormwind. He wasn't a paladin, but he was deeply respected among humans and beyond. I'm pretty sure he would have hooked up with one of the Windrunner sisters. Realizing that the humans had learned of the orcs, Blackhand wasted no time. Raiding began across the villages of Elwyn Forest, Westfall, and the southern parts of the Red Ridge Mountains. The humans, for their part, formed special units that would ambush orc raiders on horseback, running them down and killing them. Essentially, they started using guerrilla tactics, and a little later, I'll explain why this was the only right call for the humans. The King of Stormwind, alongside mobilizing his forces, began sending letters requesting aid from other human kingdoms. From a lore perspective, Stormwind had been pursuing an isolationist policy, which made the other kingdoms see them as arrogant. And as an additional factor, a certain Deathwing, the leader of the Black Dragonflight disguised as an aristocrat in Lordaeron, began mocking the King of Stormwind, claiming he was simply unable to put down a peasant revolt. For these very reasons, neither Lordaeron nor any of the other kingdoms came to help during the First War. Let's go back briefly to the Frostwolves and the birth of Thrall. As we remember, Gul'dan banished the Frostwolves, and they traveled far north to the Alterac Mountains. By Warcraft logic, they managed to cover that enormous distance without running into any humans and without getting lost, thanks to the elementals of Azeroth who chose to guide them. Upon reaching their destination, Draca finally gave birth to Thrall, which left both parents stunned. Thrall was born green. Orcs by default have a brown skin tone. After drinking demon blood, they turn green. But the problem is that neither Durotan nor Draca had drunk any demon blood, yet the child was born green anyway, and this is where you can put on your conspiracy theorist hat. What if Draca didn't have Thrall with Durotan, but with some other green orc instead? Thrall was born roughly in the second year of the war, but before the invasion of Azeroth, the orcs had spent about 3 more years on Draenor after drinking the demon blood. Okay, actually that doesn't really hold up, because even if Thrall wasn't Durotan's son, it doesn't really change anything for us. Either way, let's get back to the traditional canon. They figured that he was born green due to the corruption of their people as a whole. Durotan decided to meet with his old friend Orgrim and tell him what had happened. Worth noting that Orgrim also hadn't drunk the demon blood. Well, more precisely, he hadn't drunk the blood of one particular demon, Manaroth. Anyway, after talking with Durotan, Orgrim realized that the Horde was actually in very bad shape, and it was all because of the fell corruption. On top of that, he had noticed that the area around the portal into Azeroth had started dying, just like their homeworld. So he hatched a plan to overthrow his own war chief. The fighters who had come with Orgrim, he decided to give to Durotan so they could safely escort them back. This turned out to be a critical mistake. They killed Durotan and Draca and left the infant thrall to die on his own. Orgrim, of course, sensed something was wrong when those fighters never returned and decided to send an even more trusted group after them. The second group defeated the first and reported back that they had been Gul'dan's spies. Orgrim got very lucky. If the spies had reported Orgrim's betrayal to Gul'dan, he would have drained him dry in the most literal sense. Thrall, however, survived. He was found and taken in by the nobleman Blackmore, who would go on to turn him into a gladiator. By the third year of the war, Stormwind's economy was falling apart at the seams. The Orcs continued to raid and seize farms, forges, and trading posts, almost without resistance. According to the chronicles, by the third year after the portal opened, Stormwind had enough resources left for no more than a couple of months, and it seems the guerrilla warfare turned out to be not as effective as hoped. The Horde had captured almost all territory previously controlled by Stormwind. Unopposed, the Orcs marched through the entirety of Elwyn Forest all the way to the city walls, cutting off all access except by sea. Two clans were tasked with leading the assault on the city, the Bleeding Hollow clan and the Twilight's Hammer clan, which by my calculations together amounted to around 2,000 warriors. At night, the bombardment began using the classic Orc siege weapons, but unfortunately for the Horde, and fortunately for the humans, the Horde had underestimated the city's sea access. Under Lothar's command, thousands of elite knights landed in Westfall, crossed into Elwyn Forest, and attacked the Orcs from the rear. When the Orcs realized their mistake, they naturally tried to push Lothar's knights back. But at that very moment, the gates of Stormwind swung open, and a full-scale counterattack began. As we remember, the city had at minimum 20,000 militia and around 2,000 professional soldiers. Now let's think through why, for over 3 years, the humans never tried to force a full-scale battle with the Orcs. And as I mentioned earlier, guerrilla warfare was their best option. The human faction in Warcraft is modeled after the high to late medieval period, and we know that in the medieval era, the priority was placed on individual valor. Cavalry was therefore considered the primary combat unit, with infantry being secondary. The problem is that medieval cavalry simply cannot function effectively against Orcs, who have enormous physical advantages. This means that first of all, you simply can't trample them the way cavalry normally would. Second, Orcs don't form a standard shield wall. They move more like a dense mob with an extremely tight mass, which means that even if cavalry charges into them, it will lose momentum very quickly, and the rider will go down. And third, Orcs won't be intimidated when human cavalry charges at them. They'll most likely try to bring the horses down, and given their size, that won't be much of a problem for them. Let's take Stormwind's professional army. We had a figure of 2,700 professionals and 2,000 vassal troops. Let's assume that after a couple of years of war, the percentage of professional soldiers grew to around 5 to 8%, which adds up to roughly 5,000 to 6,000 troops. That's still not enough against the Orcs and their 17,000, who, yes, lack armor, but compensate for that with their size and demon blood, and most importantly, they have been trained to fight since childhood, unlike the human militia. Cavalry doesn't exist in a vacuum. It works tactically alongside infantry, but infantry has its own serious problems against Orcs. Medieval infantry typically holds 3 to 6 ranks deep. That is catastrophically insufficient against Orcs. You need a minimum of 8, ideally 12 ranks. The sheer size of Orcs will simply break a formation of 6 ranks or fewer. Then there's the issue of pikes, which typically measure 3 to 4 meters. That's not enough either. An Orc can still reach a human at that range. Again, you need a minimum of 5 meters. And the last point is the psychological unpreparedness of the human militia. Orcs are massive, they don't fear death, they barely feel pain, and they will keep pushing onto spears trying to reach their enemy. The slightest panic from a single soldier in the ranks will break the formation, and the Orcs will overwhelm them. What about archers? Again, things look very bad for the humans. Orcs may be lightly armored, but they have extremely thick skin. Piercing it with a bow will be nearly impossible. You have to aim for vital organs, but that level of precision requires elves, and they aren't involved in the war yet. Under this scenario, the humans simply have no chance. The only options left are to keep up the guerrilla warfare, hold the defensive line, and try to catch the Orcs off guard from the rear, the way Lothar did. There are a couple of tactical formations that could level the playing field, or even give humans the upper hand against Orcs, but there are nuances there too. The Spanish Tercio would be the ideal strategy against oversized Orcs. The inner ranks of pikemen could range from 10 to 20 rows deep. The idea is that at the corners of the pike formation, shooters would be positioned to fire with gunpowder weapons. Once the enemy got close, the musketeers would step inside the pike formation, calmly reload, and continue firing over the heads of their own pikemen. But you can probably already see the problem. The humans don't have gunpowder yet. Gunpowder is currently only available to the dwarves, and they won't join until the Second War, so this tactic would only work with crossbows, but those are weaker than firearms. As I mentioned earlier, orcs have thick skin. A crossbow is certainly more powerful than a regular bow, but still not enough. The Swiss battle formation, also known as the hedgehog. The concept is a square formation that advances at a quick march. The front ranks are pikemen with long pikes, and inside the column are soldiers armed with halberds. The depth of the formation was immense, 30 or more ranks deep. No matter how fearless the orcs are, they simply cannot break through a formation that deep. Physics won't allow it. The problem with this formation is execution. Everyone in the column needs to be well trained. Standard militia simply cannot pull it off. And the last one, the classic Macedonian phalanx. Incredibly easy to execute, but extremely effective. This formation can easily make use of militia troops. Philip II himself used shepherds and peasants in it. The key is to place cool-headed soldiers in the front ranks who won't panic when a wave of oversized brutes comes charging at them. But there's a problem here too. It's highly terrain dependent. You need flat, open ground, and forests and swamps simply won't work. And that's exactly the kind of terrain surrounding Stormwind. The only place where this formation could realistically be deployed is Westfall, but that's relatively far from Stormwind. To get there, you'd have to march through Elwyn Forest, and forcing a battle there is a very questionable and risky move. Knowing all of this, there's no doubt that the humans had no chance in open field combat. But let's get back to our orcs. Lothar did manage to repel their assault, but in the end, we know that Stormwind lost. So how did that happen? Let's break it down. As we remember, only 2 clans took part in the assault on Stormwind. Parts of those clans managed to escape and return to the main Horde forces. Blackhand was furious at this failure and was ready to execute the chieftains of those clans. But then Orgrim Doomhammer steps onto the scene. He accuses his war chief of conspiring with demons, corrupting his own people, and leading them to failure in the war against the humans, and challenges him to a Makgora, a duel to the death. An orc cannot refuse this challenge, so Blackhand accepts, and as you might expect, Orgrim comes out victorious and becomes the new war chief of the Horde. There are almost no historical parallels for this form of power transfer. The closest thing that comes to mind is the military democracy of the Northern Barbarians, but even that had no such ritual. What we're essentially dealing with is pure meritocracy taken to its absolute extreme. And now I have a question for you. As you may have noticed throughout this video, I lean toward the Alliance, so I'd love to hear from people on the opposite side. Is challenging your war chief at a moment like this an act of betrayal on Orgrim's part? We have Saurfang, who challenged Sylvanas to a Makgora. Around the time of Battle for Azeroth, as far as I know, many Horde players sided with Sylvanas and considered Saurfang a traitor. I have a similar view. Yes, in the end, Sylvanas got thrown under the bus and turned into a stereotypical female politician, but that's only clear in retrospect. There's also Nazgrim. He stayed loyal to the very end to an already unhinged Garrosh. He considered it dishonorable to betray his war chief, even if that war chief was heading down the wrong path. On the other hand, you could argue that he was actually a coward, because he could see his war chief destroying the Horde and yet did nothing, hiding behind honor. So, in our situation, did Orgrim do the right thing by the law of the strongest, or did he act dishonorably by taking advantage of the chaos following a defeat? You know where to leave your thoughts. Either way, Orgrim continued the policy of his predecessor. The orcs simply could not return to their own world. On top of that, he decided not to delay the second assault on the city. From his perspective, the attack needed to begin as quickly as possible, giving the humans no time to regroup. It seems he made it clear to the other clans very quickly that he was not someone to be trifled with, so nobody dared to rebel. Back to the humans. After the victory, they began discussing, well, what people usually discuss after a victory. But then the king receives an audience request from a certain mage named Khadgar. Yes, the same goofball who now gets around in a glowing pink hover chair. With him was also a half-orc named Garona. As for what her other half is, I won't tell you, because honestly, I don't know myself. She's either part human or part Draenei, but I couldn't find any reliable information on it. Either way, it doesn't matter. We condemn race mixing regardless. What matters is that Khadgar told them who had brought the orcs into their world. At first, Lothar and the king didn't believe it, because the three of them had been close friends, but eventually they came around, or more precisely, Lothar did. So they set off for Karajan, the Guardian's Tower. I'm not going to describe how they killed him, given that Medivh's power under the divine influence of Sargeras should have been limitless. I'm not a fan of magic in fictional works. I think it undermines the internal logic of a world. So let's simply establish the fact that Medivh was killed, and take note of specific moments from that battle that will be relevant later. The first point is Gul'dan. During the battle against Lothar and Khadgar, Gul'dan entered Medivh's mind to extract various secrets that interested him. One of those secrets was the tomb of Sargeras, but unfortunately for him, when Medivh died, Gul'dan was knocked unconscious and fell into a coma. The second point is Medivh himself. After his death, the spirit of Sargeras vanished, but Medivh himself didn't truly die. He shifted into some kind of dimension where he could continue watching over Azeroth, unseen by anyone, something like a ghost. And the third point is Garona. The battle involved not just Lothar and Khadgar, but Garona as well. She was under a spell placed by Gul'dan, which gave him partial control over her. During the fight, Medivh noticed this and tried to turn her against his, let's say, friends. However, this triggered a kind of glitch in her, and she simply chose to run, and she ran straight to Stormwind, to the king. Back to the orcs and the humans. The second assault on the city didn't take long to come, but this time the new war chief decided to bring the full force of the Horde down on the city. We don't have detailed sources on how the assault unfolded, and that bothers me. The chronicles simply state that the orcs breached the wall and stormed the city, but that's complete nonsense. The city was and still is impregnable. You can't just punch a hole in the wall and pour into the city. Anyone who has spent even a moment in Stormwind can intuitively understand that the city's defensive structure is very well designed. First of all, it's worth noting that the city is surrounded by mountains, which means encircling it with troops is simply not an option. Then comes the first obstacle, the wall, roughly 7 meters wide. The height might look small at first glance, but that's an illusion. I used my Night Elf character as a reference. Night Elves average around 190 centimeters in height. I managed to stack 11.5 of them. That puts the wall at almost 22 meters high. Let's round it down to 20 meters. That's roughly a 6-story building. In this case, trying to breach the wall is both ineffective and extremely time-consuming. In my view, the main gate should be the focus. But the gate is the most heavily defended section of the wall, so even if the orcs manage to break through it, their losses could be enormous. Let's assume the orcs somehow made it past the first line of defense. Next comes the bridge. Stormwind's bridge is solid stone and doesn't raise, which works in the orcs' favor, but it's narrow, so rushing it in a massive group simply isn't possible. After that come 2 archways. The force splits into 2 groups, left and right, and that's where a tunnel appears. At this point, the humans have 2 options. Either they seal both archways with portcullises, or they let a portion of the orcs through, and then drop the portcullises, trapping and killing that group, and creating a barricade of bodies in the process. Also worth mentioning that archers are firing from the towers throughout, with boiling water and tar being poured down wherever possible. Knowing all of this, it's safe to say that taking Stormwind by direct assault is an absolutely suicidal mission. Only a prolonged siege would work, but Stormwind's sea routes remain open, since the orcs in the First War are like the Dothraki, meaning no navy. So that scenario looks very grim for the Horde. A quick victory is simply not possible here. I'll remind you that Constantinople held out for almost 2 months from the start of the Ottoman siege, and it's still not entirely clear whether it fell due to betrayal or a careless mistake. But Constantinople's situation was far more desperate. It was under complete blockade. Either way, in the canon, the Horde managed to breach the wall somehow and storm the city. And notably, it seems they pulled this off in under 5 days. The chronicles and the book The Last Guardian state that the orcs poured into the city and the humans fought back, but everything changed because of one single event: the assassination of the king. After returning from Karajan, Garona met with the king, and due to the glitch in her head, she was unable to resist the compulsion and assassinated him. Word spread so quickly that every corner of the city heard of it almost instantly, and with that, the city fell to the Horde. The first major victory for the Horde on Azeroth. The next one wouldn't come for a long time. 30 years later, under the leadership of Sylvanas Windrunner, the Horde would achieve their second major victory, burning the Elven apple tree to the ground.